They locked me in the freezer, laughing as the door closed, and I heard the words as clear as if they had been carved into my skin. Meat lasts longer than you. I can still hear their voices echoing in the metallic chamber, mixed with the hum of the motor and the brittle clinking of frozen packages shifting on the steel racks, and I remember the way my own breath clouded before me, sharp and white, like a reminder that I was not gone yet, not meat, not a carcass waiting to be portioned. I am 74 years old now, living in a modest apartment above a bakery that smells of yeast and sugar every morning, a place that feels warmer than the house I left, and more real than the restaurant where I gave my whole life away. But in that moment, when the lock slid into place, and I was left standing among boxes of beef and poultry, my bones already stiff from years of labor, I felt for the first time, not just unwelcome, but deliberately erased, as though the people I had, birthed and fed and taught to stir sauce at the stove, wanted to prove that I was perishable, that I had passed my date of usefulness, that I was something to be stacked and forgotten until disposal. I was not always that woman, shivering in the dark with my back pressed against bags of frozen shrimp, listening to the muffled sound of their laughter fade as they returned to the kitchen. Once I was the heart of that restaurant, the one who opened its doors when it was nothing but a converted laundromat with linoleum floors and a single fryer that spit grease on the walls, the one who knew how to stretch 50 pounds of flour into bread that brought in enough customers to keep the lights on, the one who remembered which neighbor could not afford dinner and slipped extra rolls into their bag, the one whose name was spoken with respect, not mockery. I built that place with my late husband, brick by brick, recipe by recipe. And after his heart failed one winter morning, it was me alone who kept it alive, cooking through grief, smiling at tables even when I wanted to lie down and never rise, holding steady because I believed a place that fed people should not close just because the one who started it was tired. For years I did it, sometimes with help, sometimes without. And I believed that my children saw me, that they understood the labor, the sweat, the nights when I slept in a booth because payroll had to be made at dawn. But time has a way of rewriting the stories we think are solid. When my son and his wife began to take more control, I told myself it was natural, the passing of responsibility, the rhythm of generations. I told myself I was fortunate that someone cared enough to carry it forward, that my role could soften into guidance rather than constant toil. Yet slowly and then suddenly, my recipes became theirs, my stories their anecdotes, my authority a nuisance they managed with smiles too polite to be genuine. And I, who once stood in front of that hot line barking orders, found myself pushed aside to the corner, asked to sit in the office or stay home because I looked tired, treated as decoration, not foundation. That is how it happens. Not in a blaze, but in small dismissals that feel at first like kindness until they accumulate into exile. So when I tell you that I stood in that freezer, shaking not only from the cold but from the recognition of their cruelty, understand that this was not an isolated prank, not even a joke gone too far, but the culmination of years of subtle erasure, a final declaration that I was not only unnecessary, but laughable. And yet, even as my lips grew numb and my fingers felt heavy, a strange calm filled me. Because deep inside, I knew something they had forgotten. Something the frost could not take. The papers of ownership. The signature that mattered. The fact that, beneath their arrogance, the ground they stood on was still mine. That knowledge sat like a coal in my chest, warming me in a way their laughter could not extinguish. Now I live above a bakery that is not mine, And each morning I wake to the sound of bread being kneaded, to the scent of coffee drifting through thin walls. And though it is humble, it feels like freedom. No one here calls me obsolete. No one here measures my value against my speed or my silence. I walk slowly down creaking stairs. I buy a small loaf with the coins I keep in a dish by the door, and I remind myself that I am alive, that I lasted, that I was never meat to be weighed and priced. I am 74, yes, but I am not frozen. I speak now because the story must be told, because there may be another woman standing quietly in the corner of her own life, waiting for permission that will never come. Let her hear me. The lock is not the end. The freezer is not the grave. And laughter at your expense is not proof of your weakness. It is only proof of theirs. The act itself, the so-called joke that became the truth I could no longer ignore, came on a night that should have been like any other, a Friday evening when the kitchen was full of steam and orders and clattering pans, when the smell of garlic and onions floated thick in the air, and my son shouted ticket numbers, while his wife wiped down the counters as if polish alone could prove her efficiency. And I was moving slowly but steadily between stations, tasting sauces, checking the temperature of the stock, reminding the young dishwasher to change the water before the plates turned slick with grease. And though they had told me many times that I was in the way, I insisted on being present, because I had always believed that a restaurant without the pulse of its beginning loses something invisible but essential. That night, however, I felt the tension the moment I walked in, the way my daughter-in-law would not meet my eyes, the way my son's voice tightened when I asked a question about the menu change, the way one of the servers smirked as though he had been primed to expect a scene. I should have recognized it as a setup, but habit kept me blind, because for decades I had trusted that kitchens were spaces of necessity, not theater, and that no one would use them as a stage for cruelty. When the rush began to thin, they asked me to step into the storage freezer to fetch more chicken breasts, though I knew there were plenty already thawing in the prep sink, and I hesitated because my knees had been stiff that week. But my son pressed the plastic key into my hand with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes, and he said, "You can manage this one small thing, can't you, Mom?" The words slid under my skin, sharp with mockery disguised as encouragement. And though my instinct told me something was wrong, pride made me move, because after a lifetime of lifting stockpots and scrubbing pans, I was not about to admit weakness in front of the children I had raised. I pushed the heavy door open. The cold slapped me in the face, and before I had taken 3 steps onto the concrete floor, the light shifted as the door swung shut behind me. The metallic sound of the lock sliding into place louder than any shout I had heard that evening. At first, I thought it was an accident, a careless slip of the handle, and I turned quickly, expecting the door to give with a shove, but it stayed firm, and through the insulated steel I heard muffled laughter, unmistakably theirs, my son and his wife. Voices low but audible enough to make the words clear. "Meat lasts longer than you." The cruelty of it struck me harder than the cold, because it was not a slip of the tongue, not an unthinking remark, but a rehearsed line meant to sting, meant to reduce me to a commodity no more valuable than the plastic-wrapped carcasses surrounding me. I pressed my hands flat against the door, called out once, twice, then stopped. Because I understood they were not waiting to release me, they were savoring the humiliation, timing their return like a performance. And the more I banged, the funnier it would be to them. The freezer was vast enough to hold pallets of produce and crates of meat, yet in that moment It felt smaller than a coffin, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting the rhythm so that panic would not rob me of the little strength I had. My breath clouded, settled on the collar of my coat, melted into dampness that chilled my skin. I thought of the first day I had approved the purchase of this very freezer. How proud I had been to finally afford equipment that matched the ambitions of our growing business. How I had told my husband it was a sign we were moving forward, that our place would survive. I never imagined it would one day be used as a cage against me. Time in such spaces bends. A minute stretches into 5, 5 into 20, and I lost count of how long I stood there, pressing my back against a crate of frozen vegetables, flexing my hands to keep blood moving, whispering to myself that this was not the end, that they would not win by forcing me into silence. When the door finally opened, it was with exaggerated cheer, my daughter-in-law calling out, "There she is, our little ice queen," while my son chuckled behind her, and the sight of their grinning faces told me all I needed to know. This was not a mistake. It was an initiation into invisibility, a message sent in the language of cruelty that said, "You do not belong here anymore, and we want you to know it." I walked out without a word, straightened my coat, and went back to the prep table, because dignity was the only shield left to me. But inside, something cracked so loudly, I was surprised they could not hear it over the hum of the hood vents. From that moment, I understood with bone-deep certainty that I was no longer simply being sidelined. I was being expelled, and the restaurant I had given my youth to was no longer my home, but a theater of contempt. I stayed through the rest of service, plating dishes with steady hands, tasting sauces, correcting the seasoning when the young cook grew careless. But every glance from my son was tinged with mockery, every word from his wife coated in false sweetness. And the servers avoided my eyes as if proximity to me might draw their laughter too. At closing, when the chairs were lifted onto tables and the floor was slick with soap, my son slapped me lightly on the back and said, "You did good tonight, Mom. Still got some fight in you." The words hollow and cruel, and I nodded as though they had meaning, though inside I was already planning, already remembering the documents I kept hidden, already turning toward a future they could not imagine. That night, I lay awake, hearing again the metallic clang of the freezer door, the words they had spoken as if engraved on ice. And I knew this was the act that would end everything, the act that pushed me from silent endurance into decision. It was the moment of betrayal that could not be softened, not by apologies, not by excuses. Because once your child locks you away and laughs at the thought of your expiration, you understand that the family you thought you had died long before, and only the illusion remained. They did not repeat the freezer after that night because they had no need to. Once you show a person how far you are willing to go, you can move to smaller cuts, to the quiet shaving away of place and name. So the next morning, I found my key fob blinking red at the back door, and when I knocked the prep cook, a boy who used to blush when I praised his mirepoix, opened it with a practiced shrug and said, the codes had changed for insurance reasons. And when I asked, my son, for the new code, he said the system would be simpler if he were the only one arming and disarming it, which sounded like responsibility but felt like banishment. And that tiny inconvenience was followed by a new schedule taped above the time clock where next to my name the word observer had been added in parentheses, a role I had never applied for in a room I built with my hands, and I stood there with my reading glasses low on my nose, tracing the block letters as servers drifted by in their crisp aprons pretending not to see me, and I asked whether observer came with a passcode to the point of sale, only to be told my login was temporarily disabled pending modernization, a phrase my daughter-in-law delivered with that laminated smile she uses for health inspectors and bloggers, and I nodded as if I understood a language I never intended to learn, because I already speak stove and stock and patience, and none of their plastic phrases can rename the smell of butter browning in a pan or the way steam curls out of a pot of beans when the salt is right. The erasures multiplied like fruit flies after a spill you forget to wipe, always small enough to ignore individually, yet impossible to pretend invisible when they swarm. So the office I kept was consolidated into a storage shelf and my dented mug disappeared, and someone replaced my paper calendar, the one with notes in my handwriting about delivery quirks and which farmer still extends credit after a storm, with a glossy whiteboard that did not remember anything, and the cookbook where I kept substitutions and solutions and little prayers was moved without my consent to a high shelf as though the angle would age it into irrelevance, and the menu I had tuned like a radio for years began to shift under my feet. First, a sauce renamed, then a recipe elevated, then an entire section called Heritage Classics, announced on social media with photos of my hands cropped at the wrist, my handwriting scanned for the graphic, a caption that read, "Inspired by our matriarch," as if I were a portrait and not a person. And when I asked why my name could not appear plainly the way it always had, my son said the brand needed to feel contemporary and personal titles spooked younger diners. And I thought of every night I walked the floor after close with a broom and a prayer, and wondered which of those things would frighten a diner more: the word mother, or the taste of a dish cooked by a woman they preferred to imagine dead. Vendors began routing questions to management, even when the questions were about my specifications. The miller who knew which grind I wanted for the cornbread mailed samples to my daughter-in-law, and she replied with a cheerful email, choosing a flour that baked whiter but tasted like air. The fishmonger who once called me from the dock to brag about the shine on a morning catch now sent invoices with at-in accounts. And accounts was not a person who could smell the sea. It was a mailbox. And somehow even the bank began to request signatures that did not include mine, though the papers in the safe deposit box bore my name first and last and middle, the full story of it. And each time I asked to see the books, I was told we were in an interim period, that software was migrating, that a consultant had recommended new flows, and I should enjoy the relief of fewer responsibilities. And the relief they offered tasted like a pill placed on my tongue without a glass of water. They orchestrated meetings at hours I could not realistically attend, 10 p.m. after double turns or 7 a.m. On delivery days when my body needed warmth and tea. Then they recorded the meetings and sent me links that required passwords they never shared. They trained the staff on brand language that discouraged addressing regulars by first names because it created relational expectations. And the regulars looked around confused when I continued to lean across tables and ask about a grandchild's braces or an aunt's biopsy. And I watched the way some chose the new polish, because polish glitters under low light, and others gravitated toward me and whispered that it didn't feel the same anymore. And I answered with a smile that did not betray me, because a woman who has lived through lean years knows not to recruit the hungry into her private. Sivar, my daughter-in-law, had a knack for saying no kindly, No, Martha. You needn't lift that stock pot. We've hired strong arms. No, Martha, don't worry about inventory. We have a system. No, Martha, take a night off. You've earned rest. And I would have taken the gift if the rest were not laced with erasure, if the hired arms were not instructed to ignore me, if the system were not built to exclude the very knowledge that kept the walk-in from spoiling when a breaker failed at 2 in the morning in August. And I was the one who drove down with a cooler and a prayer. They gave me a new name tag that said consultant, printed in a thin, fashionable font. And the first time I pinned it to my blouse, I felt the lie of it like a pebble in a shoe. So I took it off and slid it into my apron pocket, where it clacked against the brass safety pin I have carried since the year the oven door fell off, and we fixed it with stubbornness and twine. Online, the story tightened around me like a noose made of pretty words. Press releases spoke of a dynamic young couple reviving a beloved neighborhood classic. Profiles mentioned family recipes without the family member. Influencers posed with cocktails I never would have allowed to drown out the food, and the comment sections filled with hearts and fire emojis, as if praise were a currency you could use to salt a soup. In the staff group chat, which a server showed me on her break, with wide apologetic eyes, there were jokes about how I hovered, how I corrected, how I didn't get it. And I did not weep because the kitchen has always been a place where tears taste like steam and grease, and you learn early to blink them back. But I felt the old ache in my hands that comes when weather changes, and I understood that a storm was moving through the house I built, and I could either huddle under it or move deliberately within it. So I began to gather without announcing the act. I took home the small ledger where my husband's handwriting still shows how we survived our first winter. I photographed every certificate and license. I made copies of the lease addenda and the equipment warranties. I verified with the city that the business license still listed me as owner of record. I requested from the bank a printed confirmation of signatories under the guise of a routine audit. I walked to the branch in my best coat and chatted with the teller about her grandmother's arroz con leche, while the printer chattered out proof that stories told on glossy feeds cannot change ink. Inside the kitchen, the humiliations became efficient. I was instructed to taste but not decide, to greet but not seat, to plate garnishes but not sauces. And one night, my son placed a laminated allergen protocol in front of me and asked me to sign. That I had been retrained because you know how memory gets at your age, and I signed, not because I accepted the insult, but because paper to them was theater, and paper to me was a trail. And I added the date carefully, and I placed the copy in my tote alongside invoices that bore the wrong titles. And I imagined a day when someone with authority might ask whether an old woman had truly been as irrelevant as a feed implied. The old regulars continued to come in on Sundays. The widower who orders a half bowl because whole bowls make him cry. The nurse who loves her shift breakfast at 7:30. The high school teacher who used to grade at the bar. And they noticed the music was louder, the pepper milled finer, the herbs sprinkled prettier, and some delighted in the sheen, and some looked at me and tilted their heads and whispered, "You still here, Mama?" And I said, "For the moment," and I kissed their cheeks with eyes open so I would not miss the exit when it opened, like a door on a frozen hinge. When the health inspector arrived for a routine check, my daughter-in-law steered her away from me with gracious hands and spoke in the dialect of compliance while I stood by the prep table cleaning scallions the way my mother taught me. And afterward, I learned that a citation for an improperly labeled container had been framed as my oversight, even though the labels had been removed during a photo shoot to make the shelves look less cluttered. and I said nothing to the inspector, and little to my son, because a woman who has cooked through grief understands that arguments in hot rooms burn everyone, and I needed my skin intact for what would come. They hired a consultant, a man with expensive shoes who pronounced sofrito like it was a new city he had just discovered, and he suggested we sunset the beans and rice on weekday lunch because they did not perform with the demo they wanted, and my son nodded, and I watched a dish that paid our rent when the neighborhood was not fashionable, pushed to the edge of the menu like an elderly aunt at a wedding, and I went home with a quiet fury and wrote the date on a card and slid it into the box, with my husband's watch because memory without record turns to smoke. At home, the bakery downstairs began to know my step. The apprentice waved, the owner tucked a heel of yesterday's sourdough into my bag with a wink, and I made coffee at my small stove and spread butter on bread that tasted alive, and I laid documents on my table and organized them in neat stacks, and I underlined clauses, and I circled phrases, and each circle felt like a stitch closing a wound I had believed would remain open forever. On Sundays, I walked by the river and let my hands warm in my pockets while the city moved around me, and I thought about the cruel sentence in the freezer and the way laughter hardens into a kind of glue you can either live stuck to or peel away from. Slowly, and the more they tightened their hold on the restaurant's story, the more I understood that I did not need to shout. I only needed to remain precise. I answered their texts with yes and okay and sure. I accepted the consultant badge and the observer parentheses. I stood where they told me to stand and did the work they said was appropriate for a relic. And all the while, the file in my drawer thickened, and the list in my head lengthened, and the place I once loved turned itself, inch by inch, into something I could leave without breaking. Because the first escalation is not theirs alone, it is also mine. The quiet raising of my own stakes, the decision to witness and to remember with a clarity that cannot be edited, the refusal to vanish even as they practice vanishing me, the small, relentless steps of a woman who no longer confuses endurance with consent. The shift did not come with shouting or confrontation. It came in the quiet of my apartment one evening when the bakery below had closed and the scent of flour hung heavy in the stairwell. And I spread the papers across my small table and stared at them not as relics, but as weapons. The lease signed decades ago in my name, the articles of incorporation that bore only my signature, the bank account statements that still listed me as the primary, and as I touched the edges of each page, fragile but firm, I realized that while they had locked me in the freezer, while they had laughed and erased me from schedules and menus, they had forgotten the simplest truth, that the bones of the business still belonged to me, and that the only reason they had any stage to perform their cruelty on was because I had built it brick by brick, hour by hour, life by life. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in months, as if I had been holding my breath inside their contempt. And now, with the ink before me, I could exhale. I remembered the day I signed the first loan papers, my husband's hand trembling as he held the pen, his voice full of fear and pride all at once, and how I steadied him and said, "It's only paper. The real contract is in the work we'll do." And we had done it, year after year, until the paper and the labor fused into something that fed not just our family, but the whole neighborhood. And now that same paper could free me from the prison my son and his wife thought they had designed. I held the documents the way another woman might hold a rosary, touching each line like a prayer. and for the first time since the freezer, I felt not erased, but sharpened, like a blade, long neglected, finally taken to the stone. The next day, when my daughter-in-law smiled at me and said I should take a rest from the books, I smiled back, because I knew she had no idea that the books were not hers to close. When my son patted my shoulder and said, "You've done enough, Mom. Let us handle the hard parts now," I nodded, because I had begun to understand that pretending to be small was the safest place from which to grow strong again. I was no longer asking them for inclusion. I was watching, waiting, collecting the small humiliations like beads on a string that would one day be long enough to strangle the lie that I did not matter. At night, I walked through memories of the restaurant not as wounds, but as evidence. The time the inspector praised our spotless kitchen, the day a line formed down the block after a review in the local paper, the evenings when my husband and I would collapse into a booth after closing and split a plate of whatever was left, laughing like children. And I reminded myself that those triumphs were not gifts from my son or his wife. They were mine. They were ours. They were rooted in years they had, never lived, and no amount of branding or exclusion could rewrite that. The more I remembered, the stronger I felt. And the stronger I felt, the less their dismissals pierced me. One evening, I bought myself a new notebook, cheap but sturdy, and I began to write not recipes or invoices, but plans. Who to call if I needed to move quickly, which realtor owed me a favor from years ago, which lawyer had once eaten in my restaurant, and said to me, "If you ever need anything, Senora, you call." I wrote slowly, carefully, as though each letter was a stone laid into a path only I could see. And when I closed the notebook, I felt the strange calm of someone who is no longer at the mercy of others, but at the threshold of her own choice. The symbolic shift was small in action, but immense in weight. I went to the bank on a quiet weekday morning, wore my best coat, the one still smelling faintly of onions and flour from years in the kitchen, and I asked the teller, a young man with tired eyes, for copies of every account and authorization. He printed them, slid them across the counter, and I placed them carefully in my bag. No one stopped me. No one could. That night, I spread them on the table beside the incorporation papers and the lease, and I whispered aloud, just to hear it in my own voice. "It's still mine." The words did not tremble. They rang like steel. From that night on, the laughter I had once endured became background noise. When my son raised his voice, I thought, "Shout while you can. You're standing on ground that is not yours." When my daughter-in-law called me consultant with her pretty smile, I thought, "Title me what you like. The ink on the deeds does not answer to you." The humiliation did not vanish, but it lost its fangs. I began to walk differently, slower not from age but from choice, because every step I took now was deliberate, each one a rehearsal for the day I would leave them with nothing but the echo of their own cruelty. That was the midpoint. The moment I ceased being their victim and remembered I was still the architect, the one with the key in her pocket and the name on the line that mattered. The moment I stopped waiting for their permission and began preparing for my own decision. I did not announce it. I did not confront them. I simply carried the knowledge like a quiet fire inside me, warming me against the cold of their disdain. And from that moment forward, though they did not yet know it, the story was no longer theirs to write. It was mine again. They must have felt the weather change inside me, because cruelty grows jumpy when the person it feeds on stops bleeding. And almost at once the pace of their pressure quickened in ways that were polite on the surface and predatory underneath. starting with a family meeting, scheduled at a time that pretended to be considerate and was anything but. A bright Sunday afternoon when the dining room was empty, between brunch and dinner. And my daughter-in-law had laid out lemon water and a folder of documents that looked like estate planning brochures, all white smiles and soft assurances. And my son spoke in that practiced voice people use when they're selling you a coffin you didn't ask for, saying words like legacy and simplify and safety, while sliding toward me pages where my name appeared in faint gray, as if it were already fading. And I listened without interrupting, because I wanted to hear every angle of their plan, which was not to honor me or protect me, but to ease me gently out of the frame, to make me sign a durable power of attorney, just in case, to consolidate all accounts, to reduce administrative burden, to authorize a transfer of the liquor license for continuity. And I nodded like a woman with tea in her hands and sleep in her eyes, while my pulse pounded steady in my wrists. Then I pushed the folder back, palms flat, and said that I would be happy to consult any time they wished, and that I had already consulted a lawyer of my own, who found the current structure appropriate. And my daughter-in-law smiled thinly and said, "Of course, take your time. We only wanted to make things easy." And my son reached for one more trick by mentioning a memory clinic he had researched for baseline cognitive testing. And I almost laughed. Not because the attempt was funny, but because it was so predictable, that frantic reach for a label to put over a woman's mouth. And I told him very gently that my memory was strong enough to recall the day his father. And I signed the incorporation papers, the date, the weather, the pen, the ink, and that I remembered, too, the name of the bank manager who watched me sign, and that if either of them wished to revisit those memories, I would be at the branch in the pre-morning asking for printouts, and the conversation ended like grease dropped in cold water, with a sullen hiss and a film on the surface. The next week, the restaurant rolled out a rebrand that was meant to look like a celebration and tasted like erasure. Glossy postcards mailed to the neighborhood announcing a new chapter, with a tagline that chirped about heritage refreshed, and a ribbon-cutting event where they invited me to say a few words as our beloved founder. Not by name, but by a role that keeps you on a shelf. And I stood at the edge of that crowded room with the fizz of cheap Prosecco stinging my nose, staring at a plaque they unveiled beside the host stand that listed the founding date as the year my son and his wife had moved the espresso machine and repainted the door, a year that came decades after the night I burned my hands learning the first friars' moods, and they'd framed a photograph of my hands rolling dough, cropped at the wrist so there would be no face to attach the labor to, and they applauded themselves while a blogger filmed my smile. And I smiled, because a smile can be armor when you need it to be. And I shook hands with the alderman and the bank's new assistant manager and the influencers holding phones like small mirrors. And then I excused myself to the alley where the grease bins live, and I took one long breath that tasted like onion skins and cold metal, and I called the realtor whose business card I had kept in the recipe box ever since I slipped it there after she told me, eating alone at the bar one night years ago, that she loved my food because it never apologized. And when she answered on the second ring, her voice was as crisp as a new bill, and I said, "Sophia, I think I'm ready for that conversation you once offered me." And she said, "I've been ready for you for a long time, Senora. Tell me what you need." In the days that followed, I learned how quickly people can move when the story is theirs to write, and how slowly they move when it is yours. because Sophia arrived at my apartment the next morning with a leather folder and a kindness that had nothing to do with pity, and she walked me through the bones of a sale that would need to be fast and quiet, the list of equipment with serial numbers, the licenses and the lease assignment clause, the inventory count that a buyer would want. Certified, the landlord's consent, the bank payoff figure if any debt remained, and I laid my papers before her like bread on a table. And she whistled softly when she saw the incorporation and the lease addenda and the bank statements with my name first. And she said that the market would snap up a place with this kind of kitchen and location, that two groups had already whispered to her in other contexts that they would go all cash if something like this ever came available. And I told her, cash was good, but speed was better. And she nodded and said that speed costs, but dignity costs more when you lose it. And I said that I understood the math. We agreed on a number that felt like the true weight of years without spite. We agreed on confidentiality that would last until signatures dried. We agreed on the cadence of calls and texts and which back door to use for the first quiet walkthrough. And when she left, I sat a long time with my hands on the table, feeling the grain under my skin, thinking of my husband humming off key while counting receipts. And I promised him out loud that I would take us home. Of course, pressure has a nose for resolve. And before the week ended, there was a knock on my apartment door that carried the rhythm of authority. Two uniformed officers standing politely but firmly in the hall, explaining that someone had requested a wellness check for an elderly woman possibly in distress. And I made tea and set out cups, because hospitality is a habit I cannot break. And I answered their questions with the clarity of a ledger, giving my name, my birth date, my lawyer's name, the location of my safe deposit box, and the box key on its little navy ribbon. And I showed them the incorporation papers, not because I had to, but because sometimes proof soothes the young, and the older one nodded and said his grandmother had run a bakery until 83, and nobody had the right to decide when her hands were done but her. And the younger one softened around the eyes and said they would close the call as resolved, and I might want to be careful who had access to my old address in the city records. And I thanked them and poured the tea into a plant because it had shaken too much to drink. And I sat on the floor until my breath slowed and I could feel my own strength again. The restaurant, meanwhile, developed new habits that looked like policy and felt like punishment, predicting my steps and placing small obstacles in front of each one, like scheduling deliveries for hours they knew I would come by and then postponing them, or changing the storage layout every other day so the spices I had labeled by smell could not find their way home, or quietly instructing the line cooks to answer my questions with, "We're trying a different approach," and I let it all pass over. Me like steam, because each petty move confirmed the choice I was already making, and because beneath their choreography, the old kitchen still sang its same song. The singe of garlic the moment it hits oil, the sweet relief of a stock that finally clears, the hush that falls when a room full of people take their first bite and are briefly, wonderfully quiet. Some of the staff avoided me out of fear, but a few still drifted my way like birds that remember a hand. The dishwasher who slipped me the new alarm code because he said the deliveries came wrong when I wasn't around. The prep cook who left a note tucked into the box of bay leaves that read in tiny script, "I know whose recipes these are." The server who brought me the rebrand plaque at the end of her shift and whispered, "If you don't want this on the wall anymore, I can make it fall." I told them all the same thing, that I was fine, and that sometimes the kindest help is silence, and they nodded. and I could see in their faces the relief of people who have been waiting for a grown-up in a room full of loudly confident children. Sophia moved like a woman who had promised someone long ago to never waste time. And within days, she had quietly brought through the first buyer after close, a pair of sisters who ran a bakery by the lake and wanted a warm kitchen to expand into real dinners. And I watched the way their eyes landed on the ovens like you look at a person you could fall in love with. And I listened to their questions about air makeup and amperage and the line's exhaust, and I saw the way they did not flinch at grease or fear the big mixer. And I thought, maybe. And then the next night, she brought a widower named Romero, who had cooked in 3 cities, and cried a little talking about the first time his wife had taught him to salt properly. And I thought, maybe. And then she told me quietly that the group with the cash was a small collective of cooks from a neighborhood tavern that had closed during the pandemic. And I thought, maybe. And I walked home feeling something I had not felt since before the freezer, a cautious tenderness toward tomorrow. But my son felt something too, the way a person feels the first tremor of a quake before anyone else looks up. And he tried a softer angle as if to reset the board, waiting for me by the back door one morning with 2 coffees and a voice full of rehearsed sincerity, telling me he had been under stress, that I had misread the freezer, that he and his wife were trying to modernize under financial pressure I couldn't understand, that he was afraid of losing the place, and that fear had sharpened his tongue. And I listened because I am not made of stone, and because a mother never stops hoping her son will find his best self. And then he said the thing that cracked his appeal down the middle, that if I loved the business, I would sign a temporary transfer of controlling vote for agility, and that a buyout could be arranged at a generous number once they stabilized. And I set the coffee he had brought me on the trash can lid, and I said that love is not demonstrated by surrendering your name to people who laugh when they lock you in a room. And he flushed, and for a second, the boy who burned his first omelet looked out through the eyes of the man who edits me out of photos, and I almost touched his sleeve the way I used to when he scraped his knees. And then I did not, because mercy does not mean weakness. And I told him clearly that I would no longer discuss documents in alleys or doorways, that any future conversations would be in offices with witnesses and dates and stamps. And he looked as if I had spoken a language he did not recognize, because I had. It was the language of a woman who knows the weight of her own signature. That afternoon, as if to remind me how quickly love can shapeshift into leverage, I received an email from a firm I had never heard of, CCing my son and his wife, asserting that they had been retained to advise on succession risk, attaching a draft press release to reassure stakeholders, and a term sheet proposing a consulting stipend for me in exchange for relinquishing active control. And the subject line called me founding figurehead, as if the contradiction would pass if printed on letterhead, and at the bottom was a line about avoiding damaging public narratives, a sentence that let the threat peek out from under its polite skirt. And I laughed low and long because a person who spent 3 winters making tamales overnight, too. Keep the gas on does not scare easily at the sight of corporate stationery. I forwarded the email to Sophia and to my lawyer, and then I put on my coat and walked to the river and let the wind clean the stale office air out of my lungs. And I promised myself again that the climax of this story would be my act, not theirs. Pressure does not only arrive by letter and meeting. Sometimes it comes as the past, knocking on your present with a kindness that hurts. And one evening after close, I slipped into the walk-in with a wooden wedge to keep the door from sealing because I wanted to measure my fear against the place that had been used to shrink me. And I stood there long enough to let the cold climb into my bones, but not long enough for the old panic to bloom. And I whispered the names of the women who taught me too. Cook, my mother and her sisters, and the neighbor who taught me about patience over beans. And I promised the ghosts that I would never let their work be claimed by people who mistake frost for strength. And I stepped out into the kitchen air that felt tropical by comparison, and I shut the door with my own hand, and the sound did not make me flinch. And that was the moment I knew that whatever came next would not break me. The final straining of the rope before it snaps came as a dinner they hosted for legacy patrons, inviting a dozen of the oldest regulars and using me as the lure, my name not printed but implied, whispering that I might be there to share stories. And I arrived because I wanted to look those patrons in the face and let them see me alive. And the room was full of people who had spent years eating my food and telling me about their divorces and graduations. And when my son introduced the evening, with a speech that thanked the original spirit of the brand, without saying my name, a hush fell that was not reverent but confused, and the banker coughed, and the nurse frowned, and the teacher's mouth pinched, and I took the microphone when they offered it, and I said only this, that I was grateful for every person who had ever eaten a bowl of beans and rice at that bar, that a restaurant is made of people more than paint, and that the women who taught me to cook were with me still, and I handed the microphone back before the applause had a chance to grow fake, and I left by the back door into air that tasted like rain, and I found Sophia waiting in her car with the engine low, and she said, "We have the offer we wanted if you have the courage you've already shown." And I said, "I do." And we drove to her office where the lights were warm and the printer was waiting, and the signatures would turn the pressure of months into a single line of ink that no one could laugh at without choking. The act itself was quieter than the freezer, less dramatic to the eye, but absolute in its finality. Because when I walked into Sophia's office that gray morning with my navy coat buttoned against the drizzle and my folder of documents held close to my chest, I knew that whatever I signed that day would cut through every insult, every smirk, every deliberate exclusion, and leave them standing in the ruins of their own arrogance. And though my hand trembled from age, it did not tremble from doubt. Sophia had laid out the contracts neatly on her mahogany desk, the ink still sharp, the clauses highlighted, the buyers' names printed cleanly. And when she looked at me, she did not see a relic or an obstacle. She saw a woman who had decided. And she nodded without ceremony because she understood that some choices require no persuasion once they ripen. The sisters who ran the bakery by the lake had offered fair value and promised to keep the kitchen alive, not gutted for profit or flipped for image. And that mattered to me more than an extra dollar, more than a faster close. It mattered that the ovens would still sing and the recipes would not be mocked, that people would still eat and leave fed with the same warmth I had always believed food should carry. I signed the first page slowly, pressing down hard enough that the pen left grooves. Then I signed the second. And with each signature, I felt another thread loosen from the rope they had bound me with. The rope of duty twisted into a noose of contempt. By the third signature, I thought of my husband, how he used to whistle off-key while drying glasses, and I whispered under my breath, "We are free now, love." And Sophia heard but did not comment, only slid the next page across with her steady hand. It took less than 15 minutes, all told, to dismantle what had taken them years to polish into an illusion of control. And when it was done, Sophia stamped the last page with a firm hand, looked up, and said, "It is finished." The words landed with a gravity I had not expected. I thought I would feel giddy or vindicated, but instead, I felt steady, like a tree whose roots finally reach deep water after years of drought. We sat together in silence for a while, the rain tapping at the window like a witness. And then Sophia poured us both coffee from a small thermos she kept in the corner, and we drank without speaking, because nothing more needed to be said. I left her office with the buyer's deposit already wired, the sale set to close within days. And as I stepped into the wet street, I felt the city itself exhale, as if it too had been waiting for me to stop carrying a weight that was never mine too. I walked home slowly, letting the drizzle soak my hair, and when I reached my apartment, I placed the signed copy of the contract in the drawer where the incorporation papers had once rested, and I lit a single candle beside it, not for prayer, but for memory, a ritual of release. That evening, when my son called from a number I recognized but had blocked, I let it ring, and I imagined his face when the news reached him that the restaurant was no longer his to command, that the stage he had strutted on so carelessly now belonged to someone else entirely. I did not picture him to gloat. I pictured him because I wanted to remember him as a child, hands sticky from sugar, eyes wide as he watched me knead dough, before contempt had hardened his mouth, before ambition had turned him brittle. I thought of my daughter-in-law, too, the way her manicured fingers had gripped menus and schedules like shields, and I felt not anger, but distance, a distance so wide that no words could bridge it. They had locked me in a freezer and laughed, but I had walked out and sold the building around them. No scream, no spectacle, just a signature. And that was the cleanest revenge of all, the kind that does not taste of spite, but of clarity. The next day, I walked past the restaurant one last time. The windows gleamed with their staged polish, the lights inside bright. But when I pressed my palm lightly to the brick exterior, I felt only the echo of my own labor, the nights I had scrubbed grease until dawn, the mornings I had chopped onions with. Tears blurring my sight, the laughter of regulars whose faces would never know how close the place had come to being emptied of spirit. I did not go inside. I did not need to. I stood there long enough for one of the servers to notice me through the glass, a young woman who had once slipped me a note saying she knew whose recipes these were, and she raised her hand quietly, not calling attention, just lifting it like a small salute, and I lifted mine back, and then I walked away, not hurried, not hiding, just walking into my own life. That night, in the quiet of my apartment above the bakery, I baked a single loaf of bread, not for customers, not for show, but for myself. The smell filled the small rooms, wrapping around me like a shawl, and when I pulled it from the oven and broke it open, steam rising into the dim light, I thought of the freezer and the cold that had tried to convince me I was nothing but perishable. And I smiled, because here was warmth. Here was proof. Here was life that I had made with my own hands, and no one could take that away. The climax was not the paper or the money. It was the choice, the irreversible act of saying no more, the moment I refused to be the meat in their joke and became once again the woman who could sign her name and mean it. And as I ate that bread, slowly, savoring each bite. I knew I had not only sold a restaurant, I had bought myself back. Peace did not arrive with fanfare. It came in small, steady waves that washed away the residue of years. The mornings, when I no longer woke with dread, but with the simple rhythm of life above the bakery, the hum of ovens below, the voices of apprentices laughing as they carried sacks of flour, the aroma of sugar dust rising through the floorboards like an old hymn, and I found myself grateful for the ordinary, for the slow ritual of boiling water for coffee, of spreading butter on bread that someone else had baked, of sitting by the window as the light shifted and the city stretched awake. And in those moments I understood that survival is not loud. It is quiet and persistent, and that dignity once reclaimed does not shout, but settles in the bones like a steady warmth. I walked past the restaurant less often as the weeks passed, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed to measure my worth against its bricks. And when I did pass, I saw the new owners moving with care, the sisters I had chosen, walking the floor with aprons tied and hair pulled back, speaking to customers with the ease of women who knew that food is not a brand, but a bridge. And when one of them saw me, she did not pretend not to know. She stepped outside with her apron dusted in flour, hugged me tight, and whispered that they would honor the kitchen, that they would honor the women who built it. And I believed her because her arms smelled of yeast and onions, and you cannot fake that kind of devotion. At home, I filled my shelves not with ledgers but with plants, small green shoots that reached for the light, and I found joy in watering them each morning, watching them lean and grow, symbols of my own quiet rebirth. And in the evenings, I wrote letters, not to my son or his wife who had made their choices and could live in their own silence, but to women I knew who had been bruised by invisibility, neighbors whose children spoke over them, widows who told me in the market that they felt like furniture in their own homes, and in those letters I told the truth, that humiliation can freeze you, but it does not end you, that ownership is not only about paper, but about refusing to vanish, that sometimes the most radical act a woman can take is to sell what others thought they controlled and walk away intact. And I ended each letter the same way, with the words, "Do not let them write you out." The story is yours I still cook, not for a dining room, but for myself and for the handful of friends who knock on my door with wine and laughter. And when I lay a table now, it feels lighter, because there is no ledger waiting, no critic to impress, no son watching with narrowed eyes, only the clatter of forks and the warmth of plates. And I find that food tastes different when it is not laced with resentment, that even a pot of beans can carry a sweetness when shared freely. Sometimes the young baker downstairs brings me his failed loaves, too flat or too dark, and we eat them together with butter and salt. And I tell him stories of my first failures, the batches of dough that refused to rise, the sauces that broke. And he laughs the way I once laughed with my husband, unguarded and full. And I feel the circle closing, not with regret, but with grace. I no longer hear the freezer door in my dreams. I no longer hear their laughter as a knife. I hear instead the hiss of a pan when garlic meets oil, the sigh of a room full of people as they take the first bite, the gentle knock of neighbors asking if I have extra bread, and I realize that they did not take anything from me except an illusion, the illusion that I needed their approval to keep living. I do not need it. I never did. And that knowledge is the softest and strongest thing I carry now. If another woman is listening, a woman who has been told she is past her use, a woman who has been laughed at or silenced or locked metaphorically or literally in some cold room meant to remind her of her expiration. Let her hear me clearly. You are not perishable. You are not meat to be measured and thrown away. You are the fire and the salt. You are the one who knows the recipe of survival. And if they try to erase you, find the paper that still bears your name. Find the memory that still holds your strength. Find the courage to sign yourself free. Because there is life after the freezer. There is warmth after cold laughter. There is bread that rises again even after being punched down. And you are not done until you say you are.